Sarah, welcome to this restorative justice life. Who are you?
I am Sarah Shourd, a trauma-informed journalist.
Who are you?
I am a human being on a healing journey and a justice journey.
Who are you?
I'm a playwright and a producer of abolitionist theater.
Who are you?
I am a friend and a auntie in chosen family and in biological family, and a daughter and a sister.
Who are you?
I am a child of the earth.
Who are you?
I am a person seeking visionary change.
And finally, for now, who are you?
I'm a person that is on her second cup of coffee and still a little groggy this morning. I don't know. Yeah, I've been sleeping very deep. I just moved into a yurt, so I'm in a very different environment. I'm in a big transition in my life.
Yeah. Well, with all of those things in mind, very grateful to have you on this restorative justice life today. We'll get to some of the intersections of who you are and more throughout our conversation. But we also like to start off with asking, to the fullest extent that you want to answer the question, how are you?
Oh, I'm good. Thank you. That was a really nice exercise. That was fun.
Yeah, always interesting to see the things that come up. And, one of the first things that you shared with us is, being a trauma-informed journalist. I encountered your work as a journalist a couple weeks ago as of time of recording, right? Listeners of the podcast may or may not know that I keep Google alerts for the words restorative justice. And a little bit ago, a handful of things around the death of a woman named Jen Angel popped up. Your article included in the San Francisco Chronicle. And of course, that'll be linked in the show notes for people who want to check that out. But with that, describing Jen's death and the way that her chosen family wanted the people involved in the criminal legal system, the criminal punishment system, to take restorative approaches to addressing the harm that happened in that case, was met with a lot of differing perspectives, right? From your perspective, there was a lot of yours and others' perspectives, right? There were a lot of people saying, let's respect this. Restorative justice is a way that we can heal, move forward. And there were a lot of other news outlets, Fox News, the Daily Mail, the New York Post, among others, right, who were ridiculing this, right, saying that restorative justice is about, talking about your feelings and letting killers walk free. Those who are listening to this podcast may or may not have an orientation towards restorative justice already. The way that I define restorative justice is that it's a philosophy and set of practices rooted in indigenous values of interconnection, where, of course, we're going to repair relationships when harm happens because we are a part of each other, right? Interconnection, Ubuntu, Kapwa, Metakuyasen, Inlakech, like all of these phrases get to these values of interconnection. We're a part of each other. And we live in conditions where we don't have strong relationships built or actively maintained rooted in equity and trust. And so for that reason, it's a lot harder for people to want to do that restoration. And so when I'm hearing these perspectives from, these right-wing conservative outlets about why restorative justice is not it, why it's bad, why it's actually like harmful and punitive, I don't get angry. I might have gotten angry at one point in my life. I'm just sad, right? Because oh, you live in a world, you have a worldview where you don't see the people on the other side of this crime as a part of yourself. You don't see people on the other part of this hurt as a part of yourself. And you don't recognize that you were a person who has caused harm as well and have had and have been given opportunities to heal and repair, or maybe like just get away with shit because of your power and privilege. But
more likely the latter.
I've said a lot, right? And I've said a lot, all to ask you this question. Restorative justice is something that's important to you. Where did this journey get started?
Oh, yeah. I really love that question. And in your introduction, I'd love to just start by saying, by grounding this in honoring Jen's life and legacy. Jen Angel. Is that okay with you if I start there? It just feels like the right.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then I'll definitely come to the question. But Jen Angel believed in restorative justice, and her loved ones are honoring her vision, her truth, her belief system in asking for alternatives to incarceration, and not wanting her brutal death to be an excuse to hire more police or incarcerate more people. And so I just want to start by honoring Jen as the loving and incredible world-shaping person that she was. Jen Angel, for decades, was so many things in the world, and I was watching her from the sidelines for decades because I'm only a few years younger. She was 48 when she died, I believe 3 weeks ago now, and no one has been apprehended in the case. But it was as a result of a purse snatching gone very bad. And before we dive into the complexities and nuances, just to celebrate the individual and the beautiful spirit that was lost and that transitioned as a result of that event. Jen was a abolitionist. She was an anarchist. She was a baker. She was a kind of person that she owned a bakery shop called Angel Cakes in Oakland that employed a lot of people that were directly impacted by incarceration and the system. And she was just the kind of person that was devoting her whole life to, building new worlds and thinking outside of the limited, racist and structurally unequal systems that we live under. All of us in different positions, but all of us under these systems, and have found, creative ways to liberate ourselves from within. And Jen was just one of those people. So I just want us to honor and send love to her wherever she is, in whatever form.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for centering that. And I mean, when I think about the conversations that we have here, part of it is that like harm is happening every day all around us, being addressed in some way, shape, or form, right? And the ability to have this explicit conversation around a violent death is not something that we often do, for a handful of reasons. And it's important to recognize that, like, as we're talking about like the theory and the philosophical and like big picture reasons why this work is important, like this is impacting real people who live full lives and are worthy of this kind of care. And that goes to, you who's listening to this right now, and the person next to you on the train, or the person next to you in the car who like maybe just cut you off, or the person that you're going to go into a meeting with right after you take these AirPods out of your ears, right? This work is theoretical, yes, philosophy, but it's also very practical, and so much of how Jen lived. And thank you for bringing her and centering that in this conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for giving the space to delve into some of the things, that are some of the implications of the events around Jen's life and death, and her legacy and how it's playing out. Her story's not finished. That's something I said in my article.
Yeah.
And her community is continuing to write her legacy the way that she would have wanted it, to the best of their ability. So yes, I'm a trauma-informed journalist. That was the question, right? And how did I come to RJ being an important part of my work and my life?
Yeah, the other way that sometimes we frame the question is you've been doing the work around or of restorative justice for a while now, but you probably got started before you knew the words explicitly. So, how did this start?
Oh yeah, that's real. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that gives me hope in I've been a I've been fighting the prison system as a journalist and also as an activist and an advocate and a survivor for 12 years now. And through my creative projects and my journalistic investigations have exposed the horrors and also just been again and again, found teachers inside our prison system that have guided my path in many ways. One of the things that gives me hope and keeps me going when it comes to prison and how entrenched these structures are and the belief systems that are the bedrock of these structures that are so destructive in the world. The belief in individualism and punishing the individual and not looking at the collective and not holding the collective and healing the collective. One of the things that gives me hope is that we've always been doing repair as human beings or we wouldn't be here. Mm-hmm. So as much as I look at my own personal family history and I see trauma, I see conflict, and I look at my ancestral history and I see harm done by my ancestors, and I see the ways that the strategies they use to survive that I don't agree with and don't want to replicate. I also see that this history of repair and healing in my own family structure and all around me in the world. And I think, well, it's the reason that prisons have not been successful is that humans have always been doing restorative justice.
Yeah. What was are there any specific ways that you were able to see examples of that healing within your family or within your lineage that really made an impact for you?
Well, the way that my family was radicalized politically is that my mother, when I was young, left my father because he was physically abusive. Mm-hmm. And she had the strength to get out of that situation. And we packed up the car with whatever we could fit into our little heap of junk car and drove across the country from Chicago to LA with my cat Fluffy Muffin and a few boxes of toys. And in California, in a lot of ways, I mean, California has defined my life and my identity. I'm very culturally oriented towards California, in every way. And this is where my mom and I became radical activists from the time that I was a child. We were anti-war. We were in the punk scene. And growing up in Los Angeles, we became also aware of white supremacy and our part in that, and interested in racial justice, and very angry at the patriarchy. That was a very strong theme. And so I would say that the ability to find community when you are really running from violence and the legacies of that violence mm-hmm. in my family, we were able to get outside of that and find other people like us. Yeah. And find other people that thought like us and that wanted a different world that we could build with. And that's the legacy of activism in my family. And I think it's very much connected to repair and healing and daring to find other people to build a different world with.
Yeah, I think, and this might be because I've spent a lot of the last couple weeks talking with young people about ideas of restorative justice, and then met an incredible amount of resistance from people talking about issues of gendered violence and how are you going to have a restorative process for something like that? And I get where the difficulty around that is. I also in those conversations I'm trying to highlight, and I think it might be difficult from the body that I'm in and the way that I present in the world as a cis straight dude, but thinking about if we are to rely on systems of punishment in those cases, we're not going to get healing and we're not going to get repair, right? You might get a sense of temporary safety, right? But like, what are the needs? What are the other needs that you have that are being addressed? And like, arguably, like, you're not even really safe by going to systems of punishment to get quote unquote justice. And so I'm curious, like, if that was ever a calculation that your mom was making and like she had conversations with you about explicitly, or that's something that like you gained like understanding of a little bit later.
Yeah, I mean, I was too young to understand what the heck was going on. Sure. I just knew that my mom was taking things in her own hands. And, you know, looking back now, she didn't rely on, you know, as a white woman, the fact that she didn't rely on police and the carceral state as a way out of her situation, the situation that was endangering her life and her child, is really mind-blowing. And I do think, and this connects back to Jen, you know, Jen was in the DIY punk scene too. As problematic as the punk scene can be, I mean, it's very patriarchal. It can be very white, although it's definitely not exclusively either of those things. You know, I think that was my mom's refuge. She was angry. She wanted to get out of this patriarchal relationship of control and punishment. And she found other people that were angry too, and took it into her own hands and started a new life somewhere. And yeah, I admire the heck out of that lady for doing that. And I think, yeah, looking back now, I understand even more how unusual that is.
Well, I mean, I think when we like, and this isn't I didn't mean for this to be like a full conversation on gendered violence or domestic violence, but like
I started it.
Yeah,
Sorry.
no, I mean, like if we like statistically look at like, it happens way more than it's reported to police, and like, why don't people do anything about it? Because like the police are terrible at dealing with all of this, right?
Exactly.
They're not well resourced. The police are a patriarchal entity. Who are, and like you can make an argument for like, okay, well, we just need trauma informed police, but like, let's not go there. Let's continue on talking about ways to not resource systems of violent oppression at the end of a gun. Sorry, state sanctioned oppression at the end of a gun, or other things. You talk about, you know.
Can I? I will say just really briefly, since we have gotten into this, that I. You know, you can never put yourself in other people's shoes. And sure. I don't judge women that do call the police when their lives are, you know, threatened, but at all in any way. Sometimes there really are no other means for safety. And that's why we're talking about restorative justice, right? Because those structures don't exist. And that's why a lot of people are so confused when, you know, Jen Angel's loved ones call for restorative justice. They think right away, you know, just to pivot back to that, they think, oh, that means you just want to let her quote unquote killers go free, because they've already decided that they know who these people are. They know what the conditions are. You know, they're not interested in the specifics, and restorative justice invites us to delve into the specifics of a situation where harm was done and ask, you know, what is it that we don't know here? And what is it that if we find out some of these answers, what can we actually do to prevent more crimes like this from happening? And, you know, that's something that wasn't available to my mother when I was young, and it's not available to so many people across the country. And that's why, you know, you're doing what you're doing with this podcast, right? Is to get out the message that people don't even know what our restorative justice can look like. So let's talk about that.
Yeah. What was your formal introduction to the words?
I'm pretty sure that I think it was, do you know Generation 5?
Mm-hmm.
That I went to a workshop early in my 20s, and I believe that word was mentioned then, but it was definitely the first time that the concept, you know, Gen 5 as an organization deals with domestic violence and violence against women and children, and sexual violence. And they talk about how in order to really prevent these horrible acts from happening in our communities, we have to continue the work for 5 generations. We have to do the work with that kind of long vision, where we're considering the people that are not born as part of our community, because we're preventing violence, with that kind of foresight. So I think it was then. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think and I don't know if these were the words that used, Generation 5 is often credited with using, bringing the framework of transformative justice, right? Like transforming the conditions under which harm is happening. So we're not trapped in these cycles of violence. They're largely credited for thinking about a transformative justice framework, knowing that this grew out of a restorative justice way of dealing with individual incidents of conflict and harm, right? We can solve something that went on between two people, but some of the root causes are outside of what just went on between those two people. When we're talking about patriarchy, when we're talking about the prison industrial complex and all of these things, it goes beyond just hey, what are the things that these two individuals need in order to heal and move forward in a way that is meeting their needs as much as possible, right? There are societal conditions that we need to be thinking about. There are community resources that we need to be building so people have other ways of dealing with conflict and harm that aren't perpetuating moments of conflict and harm. And so when you had this conversation, or we're in this workshop with Generation 5, what was it about it that clicked for you, and what did that lead you to in this journey?
I mean, at the time I was doing anti-racist work in Oakland, and I was doing indigenous rights solidarity work with the Zapatista movement in southern Mexico. So I was starting out as doing international human rights work and a lot of anti-war work. And it resonated with me with my family history, but it wasn't something that I was ready to really delve into. It was after my own incarceration, and for the last 12 years, working on exposing the brutality of solitary confinement in particular as a control mechanism, and as one of the principal control mechanisms that suppresses dissent and allows for incarcerated people to fight for their rights, their human rights, and to organize. People are disappeared to the whole in order to stop that. You can't, I can't do anti-prison work without having a really clear vision on what is the world that we're trying to create. And then you realize that actually anti-prison work is creating that world, that it's impossible to focus on the problem without also asking yourself, am I part of building the kind of world where that is not based on these, punitive and racist, hierarchical, and just the most negative possible worldview in the world. It creeps, these institutions are so pervasive, the prison and carceral state, it affects everyone in our society. I really believe that. People think that somehow if they're not directly affected, it's not affecting them, but it really is how we relate to one another is affected by the fact that we put millions of majority Black and brown people in cages in this country. And so that invitation, again, in order to continue focusing on the work of prison abolition, I have to also be able to have a restorative justice practice in my life, in my relationships, in my family. And it has to be very informed by my anti-racist practice and commitments.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you glossed over my incarceration. So I'm going to ask you to share as much as you want to about that in a second. But just to bookend what you just said about, abolition is great, but in the words of Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Miriam Kaba and maybe others that I'm mashing together in a paraphrase, right? Abolition of these systems is as much about presence of life-giving institutions and systems as much as it is the absence of these death-making institutions, right? And so we can say we want a world without prisons, but we need something in order to be able to deal with the conflict and harm that is going to continue to happen because humans are messy with each other, and we're going to continue to harm each other. And what are the ways that we're going to deal with that without locking people up, isolating them from their communities where they might have been causing harm in one specific instance, but they were also like probably contributing in a lot of different ways, and they were also being supported in a lot of different ways. Pulling someone out of the place where they're being supported and expecting them to be better is not really an effective way of dealing with conflict and harm. I think like it makes so much sense, and it's not very common. Like even for those listening or longtime listeners, right, that I am a relatively new parent, and as we're looking at daycares, the conversation that we had the other day was about like how a daycare deals with discipline, and they were talking about suspensions, and I was like, suspensions for like a 1-year-old, right? Like, what are you talking about? And so obviously, like, it's not where my kid is going to be going, but
what are you talking about? Oh,
when we are in a society that relies on punishment so much, like, we need to know what these alternatives are, and this is so much of your work. I do want to, as much as you want to share, like, help give us some context for your anti-prison work. You talked about, your experience with solitary, right? And, if we think about restorative justice as being about interconnection, solitary is like the absolute other end of that spectrum, where you are isolated, cut off from most of the outside world in really extreme ways, to the extent that you're comfortable or want to share here. Can you give us some context?
Yeah, of course. As a result of my, or as an extension of my anti-war work in my 20s, I moved to the Middle East, and I lived in Yemen, and I lived in Syria, and I was on a trip in northern Iraq, which is, at the time, it was before ISIS. It was Kurdistan, an autonomous region that is pretty pro-American in a bizarre way. I mean, I'm very against my country's foreign policy, obviously, but I was in a region where they were giving me high fives because they love George Bush. And so I was in a part of the Middle East. The reason I mentioned that is where my guard was really down, and I wasn't on a journalist I wasn't investigating anything. I wasn't working as a journalist. I was hiking, and I was captured and held as a political hostage. This was in 2009, and I was in solitary confinement for 410 days, completely incommunicado. And in that period, all I wanted was to get back to the stream of life and to the web of life. And it felt like being plucked out of everything that I ever loved and having my life ripped away from me. But there was a chance I could get it back. And I knew that if I did get it back, I would commit my life to justice and for other people. And I would, just want to repay the world for not forgetting about me, not leaving me to die there. And there was a very strong movement for my release. And, my imprisonment was very high profile at the time. And that had to do with the longstanding animosity between the Iranian government and the US government. And we were part of the nuclear deals, and we were pawns in a much larger political game. But when I got out, I right away wanted to find other people that I was trying to understand how to heal from solitary confinement. And those wounds are so deep. It's the wound of belonging, being rejected. And even though I knew that I wasn't there because of anything I'd done wrong, it's really hard not to blame yourself. It's really hard to hang on to your ideals and your choices and your path in life and not feel like it must be horribly wrong with me that I'm being hurt this way. Because, it affects you psychologically, it affects your spirit and it affects your neurons, your frontal lobe. And it makes you attack yourself mentally. You become your own torturer. And so the faith that I had was this vision of being able to rejoin the stream of life and become a part of collective liberation. And so every day I count myself very grateful that I am a part of that the movement for collective liberation in this country in the different hats that I wear.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And while the circumstances of your incarceration are different than what most people who are incarcerated experience in the United States, like there are very similar, like there are a lot of similarities, right? Like they're not necessarily country to country political reasons that many people are incarcerated now, but the way that we rely on punishment as a means of control, right? And, you got caught up in foreign policy decisions that like were made way above your head. People who are being caught up within the criminal legal system now, yes, by individual actions, right? Like you chose to go on a hike that day and like that wasn't wrong. Yes, someone decided to participate in the underground economy as a means to make ends meet for their family. Like, how are we assigning value to those things, right? The conditions under which your everyday choices were made were rooted in violence and control. And, the situation that people face in the U.S., like prison industrial complex, like are not the same as like what you experience, right? But the ideology behind using punishment as control to get what you want as fear, like it has really similar effects on people, right? Exactly. When you talk about the way that you are isolated and like the psychological warfare that you end up doing to yourself, like is the same thing that happens to people who are kicked out of their communities or removed from their communities, whether that is within the criminal legal system, whether it is within, schools. When we talk about suspension, right? You're telling someone to leave this community, you're taking someone out of this community, not providing them with any kind of support or means to change, and expecting them to come back just more damaged, more like having animosity towards the people who did that towards them. And, again, with your experience not being with the US government, not being with people who you might have felt were like your people who were doing this to you, I imagine, I'm not even going to try to put myself in your shoes. I'm going to ask.
It's a lot.
Yeah.
It's a lot. Whenever my story comes up, I'm like, I don't want it to be too much of a distraction. It was 12 years ago, there are hundreds of thousands of people experiencing this now in our own country. But I will say that the common denominator is that this serves state power and control, that incarceration, it served the Iranian government to punish an individual for systemic problems. And it served the US government for me to be in there too, because they both wanted to continue to sell the story of the other of being the enemy of the people. And incarceration and the carceral state in all of its forms serves institutional power. It serves people in power. It's a way of punishing individuals instead of coming up with solutions that would serve humanity.
Right. Thank you for helping me pull out of that. I think about making sure that we are asking those questions of like, who does this benefit when we're facing these issues, right? Over the last couple weeks, right, we're talking about harm constantly happening, in the wake of the Monterey Park, Half Moon Bay shootings, right? Like very close to where you and I live respectively. I've been in deep conversation with folks in the Asian community about grief and like what happens, who benefits, right, when we grieve privately or like just try to like push past it quickly, right? Capitalism benefits, right? White supremacy benefits when we don't take time to stop and acknowledge the harm that is continually happening. And so much of what happens is like we just numb ourselves to what's going on in the world because it is constantly happening to us every day. And I think, just to tag back to what we're like what initiated this conversation, right? Jen's death, right, is something that was out of the ordinary, like the way that her and her family wanted us to address and approach this kind of harm, like it is out of the ordinary. And so like that's why we are like taking this time to talk about it. But, these things, like you were saying, are constantly happening to us on a systemic, and at the hands of the state, and the way that we interact with each other individually, both by the mechanisms of policy from schools or the organizations that we participate in or work for, but even in the mindsets that we have in our everyday lives. There's a question coming out of here, I promise, when I think about the way that you talked about, wanting to, for lack of a better word, give back, serve humanity towards our collective liberation. What are some of the ways that has manifested for you over the last couple of years, last 12 years, right? I imagine there was a time of a lot of intensity right after, but when you were able to regroup and be a little bit more strategic, what have you thought about and how's that manifested?
I'm happy to talk about that. And I also just want to say, I'm glad you brought it back to grief. It's something that I'm learning to do still. And it's something that I believe my ancestors are not good at. There's, as far as, white culture in particular, there's always this push to just keep it moving, and I think this also, so I came out of prison and dove into social justice work and didn't take time to grieve. And there was a lot of consequences to that. And I'm recognizing now, when I have this very driven personality, but I want to make sure it's not driven by guilt, because that urgency culture can be very destructive. And it can be, particularly destructive as a white person when I'm working in Black and brown communities. Healing and goes at its own pace, and the grief process cannot be rushed. And I've heard that several restorative justice organizations have reached out to Jen's loved ones, and offered to start doing grief circles, and I'm really happy about that. And they're still deciding what kind of support they need, but they're getting that support, and that is really, a lot of Jen Angel's community, you and I talked about this earlier, are people that are fighting against prisons and policing, that want, one of Jen's chosen family loved ones is Emily Harris from the Ella Baker Center, and they're working on policy change to decarcerate and fight against harsher sentencing. And this is now Emily and many of Jen's loved ones find themselves on the other side of the equation. And that's kind of, I think, something that RJ reminds us of, is all of us are going to be on the side of perpetuating some kind of harm in our lives and being harmed. And there's very different positionality based on race and gender and class and different and obviously Black and brown. It's very important to emphasize how much Black and brown populations are targeted by the carceral state. Mm-hmm. But this harming and being harmed is a part of just being human, period. And I think after being harmed myself, it wasn't the first harm. We talked about how I grew up in a family with domestic violence. But I really saw myself as being, it became very, very clear to me that wanting revenge wasn't going to do anything. The Iranian people, I support. I protested against the possibility of war in Iran. I went to the Middle East as an extension of my anti-war work. There was no way that I was going to be. And also, Iranian people loved me in prison and helped me keep going. We were all in the same boat. So you find yourself one morning on one side of the equation of being human, and you can very easily wake up the next morning and be in a very different position. So I think that that's something important. This is why restorative justice is so based on dialogue. We don't know the story of the perpetrators of the crime that led to Jen's injuries and death. We don't know. We do know that it is very unlikely that they woke up that morning wanting to do any sort of violence. They woke up with an economic need, period. Mm-hmm. And restorative justice, a lot of people that are reactive to it and don't understand what it is, they say, well, yeah, but you're just making excuses. What about, accountability? And restorative justice is all about accountability, but our prison system has failed to provide us with that accountability. And
Yeah.
the current system is not working, and anyone who's paying any attention knows that the system of mass incarceration is not fulfilling its promise to provide safety to the community. And so people need to look outside of that system at how do we make safety, and we make safety through looking at the root causes of these crimes, which doesn't mean letting people off the hook, doesn't mean saying that what they did is okay. But it's, as Lonnie Morris said in the article I wrote, it's about looking at the realities that breed this kind of crime, and what can we do to prevent more of it.
Yeah. I think, like, I do want to give grace and understanding for people who oppose restorative justice, because I think in the way that the words restorative justice have been used over the last, I'll say 20 years, specifically when it comes to the framework of the education system and breaking the school to prison pipeline, the execution of that has been like pretty poor, right? Like, you can make policy changes that say like, hey, we're going to do restorative justice work, but that doesn't mean the people in that building are equipped to do it. It doesn't mean the way that schools are structured are equipped to like make that time to hear people's stories and provide people with the resources they need in order to heal and make things as right as possible. And so, I mean, again, this is coming off of a week where, or a little bit of time where I've spent a lot of time with young people who are really wrestling with these ideas of restorative justice, because like, hey, you say this is a restorative process, but all I see is that this person got talked to and they're back in class, right? And like they did the same thing 2 weeks later, right? Or again. And I know that happens. And I would say that those, when we talk about, restorative justice being about relationships, like how are we bringing those people into relationships and holding them accountable to the things that they agreed to within the context of those restorative conversations, right? Part of that requires you building a relationship with those people in order to make sure that they're following up on the things that they said that they were going to do to make things right, or to not do those things again. And if we're not doing that, we're also failing, right? We're also not living up to the promises of keeping people safe, building safe communities. And, as much as like I want to be an advocate for everything restorative justice, not everything that people say is restorative justice is restorative justice. And so like I get where that critique can come from on some level. Mm-hmm. And right, that's why the work of Amplify RJ is so important, where like, let's get really clear about what this is and how to do it and do it well, acknowledging that like we're not going to be perfect in our execution as people, right? The promise of restorative justice is that harm will never happen again, right? The promise of restorative justice is that we will have the skills, the tools, the practices to acknowledge each other's humanity, right? And acknowledge the needs and try our best to meet the needs of the people who have been impacted by an incident of harm, right? Both the person who was harmed, person who caused harm, and the other people who have been impacted. When we think about, the organizations that have reached out to Jen's family, right? I think we should reiterate that the people who caused Jen's death have not been found, right? But you're talking about like, how can we meet your needs? Like to process this like immense grief, right? That has happened, right? What are the material needs that you have? And, we'll also link the GoFundMe to for Jen and her family in the show notes as well, right? Like how can we meet those material needs? The needs that are caused by harm rarely, I don't want to say never, but like very, 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 very rarely require like the person who caused harm to then be harmed again. Right. We do want safety, right? We do want assurance to the extent possible that those things won't happen. But that doesn't necessarily mean that looks like putting them in a cell, taking them out of their community, doing active physical violence to people, right? The adage, like an eye for an eye leaves the whole world blind, right? When we're thinking about causing people harm who have caused us harm, right? What need are we meeting, right? Danielle Surratt in the book Until We Reckon.
Until We Reckon.
Yeah. And many others like have laid out examples of lots of people who have caused harm, who have been harmed, but like what they're needing is safety, assurance that it won't happen again. Very rarely is it like, I need that person to be punished. We hear stories of people whose family members have been murdered, right? Sitting in the courtroom and hearing the guilty verdict and the sentence and like feeling like maybe a tinge of like acknowledgement and like a good feeling that like, yes, this person did a thing that hurt me, but now they're just being hurt more. And like, how is that healing me? I really want to question people like I'm specifically not naming them, one, for clout reasons, two, just because like this is not just about the individuals behind the Fox News, Daily Mail, New York Post article, right? When you see justice as being like hurting other people so you can feel better, like I want to ask you like why, right? And like what is it about those other people that you don't see connected to as a part of yourself?
Yeah. And I just want to validate too, this is like the pain of being in a family of a person and losing a person to horrific violence is unimaginable. And that pain, it really needs to take up space too. I think sometimes we're guilty of going a little bit too fast in the restorative justice or transformative justice conversation. It's just the emotional catharsis that needs to happen before you're ready to forgive is so real. I mean, and no one's asking people to just skip over, because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about it's grief that actually keeps us soft and stops us from hardening and becoming the kind of people that can perpetuate or look the other way when it comes to harm in the first place, right? And so, no one is saying that people shouldn't be angry, that people shouldn't want to see. I mean, as an abolitionist, I believe in that we need something along the lines of like centers for incapacitation. The one piece of the carceral state that I think is needed, and this is my opinion coming from me, is that sometimes people need to be removed so that we can figure out what's going on. What needs to, what they're not safe to themselves or others in their community, and they need to be removed in an incapacitation center, incapacitated, while we figure out what is the right way to move forward here, while we get more information about the specific circumstances that led to this harm being committed. And, does this person need therapy? Do they need mental health services? Do they need a mentor? Do they need housing? Is there conflict resolution that's needed in their community? What kind of healing will make it so that this person is not driven to do something like this again? And we know that, as in contrast, our carceral state, and Daniel Shourd says something like this in her book that you mentioned, Until We Reckon. We're responding to violence with our carceral state in the same way that we know that the main drivers of violence, right? So we're adding fuel to fire. We're putting people in conditions that make people more violent. And also another thing Shourd says is that the people that we're punishing are those that we're failing to protect. So how can we hold these realities that in these moments, these instances of harm, everything that is failed in our society is packed in there, and clearly we're not doing anything to address those root causes of harm, those drivers of harm. In Alameda County, I investigated restorative justice for an article that I published in the Atlantic a few years ago about preventable deaths in Santa Rita jail. And I compared that to Los Angeles County, that actually has a lot more funding for diversion programs and, sentence reductions. Alameda County has a dearth of these options. for Jen's loved ones, they're saying, we live in a county where a lot of people are fighting for restorative justice, and our district attorney needs to give us those options. We deserve those options as her loved ones. We want to uphold what Jen would have wanted, and we want to weigh in on, if people are apprehended, we want to weigh in on the charges. We don't believe that our communities are served by this disproportionately long sentencing. And we want to weigh in on the possibility of an early release and give this person, if these people are apprehended and jailed and that's the way that it goes, we want to weigh in on what can we provide as far as mentoring and therapy, and weighing in on how to get them out as soon as possible, and how to address the root causes of what came to play that day, that led in us losing our loved one, forever. We'll never get Jen back. And it's important that the people that were involved in this understand what a beautiful life was taken. But sending someone to prison without any kind of restorative process, it's never going to result. It's rarely ever going to result in any real understanding of the harm that took place. Piling harm on harm on harm, right?
Yeah. And, when people ask questions about restorative justice, what do you do with X? What do you do with murder? You can't say murder and leave it there, right? You have to look at the individual circumstances under which these things happened, right? When we're talking about death caused by a purse snatching gone wrong, those have different needs than something that might have happened between a domestic abuse case gone wrong, right? Those incidents, while they both result in somebody's death, require different needs because of the people involved, the relationships involved, right?
Exactly.
These people who caused Jen's death weren't people who Jen, probably not people Jen intimately knew, right? And so, what are the needs that have been created? It's going to look different, right? There are within the case of somebody who has killed their spouse in a domestic abuse incident, right? The needs of the other people impacted, maybe children in that situation, right? Those are things that also need to be considered. And so when you say hey, what do you do when XYZ happens, right? Do we want these children to grow up in a world without access to their parent forever because of the thing that their parent did? I know that many people would say, yes, their parent did an unforgivable, unspeakable thing. But we also have to consider that, maybe those children had a really good, loving relationship with their parent in that way. And what are the ways that we can not cause more harm by taking that person away from them forever and being cut off, yes. Right? So, those are really dramatic, specific, and very real things that happen. But just want to emphasize that restorative justice does not allow us to say all right, 15 to 20 years or 20 years to life, right? And problem solved, right? It is laborious work. The ways that we can go about manifesting that are diverting resources from prisons and policing, because people who are doing this kind of healing work need to be resourced. But it is worth it to get outcomes of liberation, healing, and I think real justice for the people who have been impacted by, unspeakable harm.
Yeah. I mean, what if we find out, that there was a specific cause, teenage pregnancy, sexual violence in the life of the people that were out there doing crimes that day, and fatally, which resulted in Jen's fatality and the end of her life. What if we find out that there's a specific cause? We don't know what it is. It's something we may not even be able to begin to imagine. Gentrification, housing issues, homelessness, and Jen's community got together and decided in her legacy, we want to address this root cause. We want to do something to help the people in these situations, so that we can go to the source of this crime, as opposed to ignoring it completely. And I think it's worth mentioning that a lot of the people that are doing restorative justice and transformative justice work are currently and formerly incarcerated people, because it's the people that find themselves at the intersection of all these hard realities in our society, and that realize how incredibly urgent it is that we find new ways of addressing it. So people do restorative justice and transformative justice kind of dialogue inside prison, and then they come out and are leaders in the community. And a lot of the people that I've encountered in my own work as a abolitionist theater producer and writer, playwright, is inspired by what I learned when I investigated people inside solitary confinement, the ways that they took care of each other, the ways that they found to create community and strengthen community in the most desperate of circumstances. And then when they come out, these people are just unstoppable on the outside, as far as how much they have to give back to their communities and how visionary they are.
Yeah. And I'll say, like, in spite of the conditions that they were put in, not like this mentality like, oh yeah, see, we put them there and they learned. No. And it's not like there's no consequence. You know, a lot of people that I know around the country, we did a tour of my play last summer, the End of Isolation tour. And we went to 10 communities on the front lines of changing the policy to ban solitary confinement inside our prisons and jails, in alignment with the principles of decarceration. The idea that the less people that we have in prison, the less people we're going to be torturing. And we are torturing people in order to maintain control inside our prisons. Make no mistake about it. Torture isn't something that happens in other countries like Iran. It happens in our backyards, in the prisons and jails where our loved ones are being taken. And the only function of the torture is to maintain a completely heinous and brutal system of incarceration that doesn't rehabilitate people, that doesn't serve public safety. And the other function is to suppress dissent so that people inside are not able to, if they are standing up for their human rights and organizing with each other, they're disappeared to the whole. So we traveled around the country, and a lot of the formerly incarcerated organizers that are shutting down jails and opening up restorative justice centers around the country, they're incredible human beings. And I just want to emphasize that it takes its toll. These are people doing the work of 20 people. And and part of that is driven by what they've seen. They can't forget. I mean, I can speak from my own perspective as a survivor. I can never turn my back on the fact that millions of people are in cages in this country and around the world, because I've lived it. And once you've lived it, it's a part of you, and it's not a reality that you can or want to forget. But it takes its toll. A lot of people are sort of driven by an unbelievable sadness and grief, which is kind of where we started. And they're carrying a burden for a lot of us that no one person should have to carry, if that makes sense. A lot of the formerly incarcerated people that I know, that's how I feel about what they're doing in the world. It's just really carrying our collective burden. Yeah, it's really similar to, and not one-to-one, right? But thinking about, it's not the job of Black people to educate white people about white supremacy. It's not necessarily the job of people who have been incarcerated to do all this education to people who have not been, or who have not been directly impacted in the way that some others have been. It's very helpful and very grateful for you and others who are doing that work. But as someone who hasn't been incarcerated, hasn't been directly impacted by the criminal legal system like that, I do feel a sense of obligation to people who I've encountered over the years, right? Both from working in an employment program, helping folks who are out of job because of their former incarceration, like finding work, from folks who I've met inside who have done any number of things under like very disparate economic circumstances to try to make ends meet, right? Like telling those stories and drawing connections between the ways that things that we're doing in our everyday lives promote that carceral mindset, promote pushing people out of institutions in our communities, do end up having like these big drastic implications of like putting people in places where they're being tortured, right? So, with a person with that privilege of never being incarcerated, like, what am I doing with that? I know, like, as a white person, right, like, when it comes to doing this work with both decarceral work, abolitionist work, but also like racial justice work, like, those are things that you've considered. How do you navigate those spaces?
Well, I mean, I'm the farthest thing humanly possible in many ways from being system impacted. I'm a survivor of torture. I'm formerly incarcerated. But doing this work and navigating my privilege and whiteness, it is my work as a white person to speak out about incarceration, especially since I navigate this strange identity as a survivor of torture in another country. I also, as a trauma-informed journalist, it is my work and in alignment. I mean, I believe it's all of our jobs to heal and fulfill our reasons for being here. Our essential self is essentially what we're responsible to how to be in community and support other people's healing and growth. And we all navigate that in different ways. And I approach it as, how do I do this work without doing harm, right? Which is a very restorative justice model. And as a transformative justice journalist, trauma-informed journalist, I'm asking myself, I'm interviewing people of color, I'm interviewing trauma survivors, I'm interviewing people with mental illness. How do I do that in a way that doesn't do more harm? Because the institution of journalism has done and continues to do a tremendous amount of harm by not being sensitive to the fact that people's stories is you can't no one can understand how essential to our identity our story is. And people have a right to shape their story in a way that is empowering and true for them, and to not be manipulated into telling their story in a way that might harm them or hurt them. And this is not an easy thing to do. And it's one of the reasons, especially under the institution of journalism, with deadlines and editors and all these people that have control over what actually gets printed, that under my name, that I don't have control over. And it's one of the reasons why I've shifted to doing creative projects, because with creative projects, I have more freedom to do my work with integrity and in relationship, because I don't have this whole institution of a particular platform, breathing down my neck. And I've gotten response from communities that I've worked in, both in a journalistic capacity and on the creative, theater and graphic novel. I did graphic novel as well. That it was really different working with me than it is working with other journalists, because I take my time and I encourage people to take breaks and to take care of themselves. And I work with, I think that transparency is the new objectivity. I try to be very transparent about my own lens and where I'm coming from. And none of us are objective, I have skin in the game. I care a lot about the communities that I'm working in, and I'm proud of that. And I want to make sure they know that. So yeah, I'm sorry, I can't remember your question. Did I?
No, I mean,
did I go into
thinking about the framework of no, I mean, you answered the question to, what was present to you. I think the question was about doing this work in a white body, yes, and the considerations that you're making. And I think you did
well, I would like to say more about.
Yeah. Is there anything else that you want to?
You can't separate my commitment to anti-racism to my commitment to being trauma-informed or being an abolitionist. And as a white-bodied person, I am very much committed to doing the somatic work that I need to do, because you can say all the right words and the energy that you're bringing into a room has impact that carries often whiteness and white culture with it wherever I go. And I've actually learned that there are spaces that I shouldn't be in, period. I was invited to be part of a transformative justice circle in Chicago, and by people that I've worked with. And I walked into the room and I realized everyone else in this circle is system impacted. and I am the farthest thing from system impacted. And I, even though I was invited here, I need to determine whether this is a place where I'm really going to have impact that I don't want to have, and a space that I shouldn't participate in. So that's one of the things that transformative justice has helped me be more aware of, is how much space and the impact that I'm having in spaces, and how much space I take up just with my whiteness alone. Mm-hmm. And as a survivor, sometimes it just increases the space that I take up, because people are curious about my story and it's unusual. And I just want to decenter my whiteness and decenter my, I can't be anything but white in these spaces, but it's my responsibility, and it's in alignment with my belief system to be sensitive to how that whiteness is impacting the people around me.
Yeah. I think you're conscious of that, and you did I think you modeled it earlier in our conversation, where we, might have gone on further conversations about, what it looks like what it looked like to be incarcerated overseas. And so I just wanted to call out the model of that there. But I also want to acknowledge that in your body, there are certain people who will listen to you that won't listen to me or other people, right? And there's a conversation that I had on this podcast with Ethan Ucker a couple episodes back, and he's a white man who has been doing a lot of work alongside or from behind people who have been impacted or who are currently being impacted. With the specifically thinking about gun violence reduction framework, taking a harm reduction approach to gun violence, or with people who carry guns, and thinking about the positionality and the reality that there are people who will listen to him that won't listen to the young people that he's working with. How do you carry that consideration?
I mean, that's what I am. This is the platform that I've been given, and that the voice that I have. I've always wanted to work as collaboratively as possible to elevate other voices. And that's why my work as a journalist and an artist is not about telling my own story. But at the same time, it's good for people that have direct experience to be a bridge in these areas. And so with all of the theater performances that we do, we're always trying to get a two-pronged audience, where we're getting people in the room that are stakeholders, that are not directly affected by incarceration, but can affect the policy and the way that our communities are responding to harm that's committed, and people that are directly affected, that there's the power to to bear witness to to a story that you can relate to so powerfully on stage, and to have, the atrocities that happen inside our prison system, and the incredible courage and love born out of these circumstances are so hidden from the public. And theater is such an amazing way to have something viscerally brought to life. It's almost as powerful can be as going into a prison. If you've never been into a prison, going to one of our shows is what we've been told many times, is that it's such an immersive thing. So I'm always trying to reach those audiences, the privileged and white affluent audiences that don't think that they're affected by mass incarceration, that they think that, oh, that's someone else's problem. It's not my belief. I believe it diminishes all of us. And I think that's part of my desire, is to make that clear, that no one can live in a society that tortures and imprisons people on such a massive scale and not be affected or diminished by it. Our imaginations are diminished. Our ability to love one another and be in community with one another is diminished. And we're all made less safe by the existence of the carceral state. We're put in a position of insecurity and fearing our neighbors, fearing people that are different than us, and believing that by hurting them, we will somehow be stronger or better. And that's just a belief in maintaining your own privilege and power. And look where that's gotten to us. That's gotten us into a place where none of us feel at all hopeful, about the future of our government and our social institutions, a lot of us are looking outside of those paradigms, but we also need to look inside ourselves as
Yeah.
as white privileged people, because we've internalized those paradigms.
Yeah. I think like I had like 80 billion thoughts racing through
Great.
my head. And I think like,
Yes, let's hear them.
yeah. So for those who have been listening to this podcast feed, on Tuesdays or Wednesdays, depending on our production schedule. As of late, we've been having conversations about the HBO show, The Last of Us. And, Kala and I have had conversations about like, oh, what are the things that we want to talk about next? But like what you were just talking about is like to the Batmans of the world, like Batman's origin story in some of the iterations were like his rich parents were murdered, like leaving a show, right? Or like leaving a party, leaving some kind of function, right? And they had the ability to maybe address the mental health issues or like the poverty issues the person who mugged them was facing in a given moment, and they didn't do that. And so like as I'm thinking about, like what is the call to action that you have of white people, privileged folks who encounter your artwork, who encounter your theater? Like I think part of it is money, right? Like reallocation of funds. And like this is like recalling back to the conversation that I had with Ethan about like, how are we using the system, using the resources of the system to like further liberatory causes, right? I think that's one part. But I think I'm also remembering conversations that I've had with Emmy Aguilar, and this wasn't ever aired on the podcast. This was in a workshop that we did on the difference between land acknowledgement and efforts at land back. But, yes, pay your land taxes to the indigenous folks who are traditional caretakers, stewards of the land that you live on. But also like the invitation is into relationship, right? Like building relationships, getting proximity to people who are directly impacted, will help you figure out more authentic ways, more ways that work for you to, one, draw connections to the ways that you are actually impacted, but two, like we can come up with these solutions together with the resources and ideas and experiences of people from across all these different sectors. I know that went like, and then now we ended on a point, but that was a really deep, good answer and sent me really thinking.
Yeah. And I think, and I love that question too, is what am I asking of the white or privileged people that come to my shows or read my articles? And, I think my hope is I want them to lose faith in these institutions. I want them to lose faith in the carceral state. I want them to really recognize how much racism and our country's origin in the institution of slavery continues to inform not just the carceral state. I mean, that is a huge way that slavery has morphed into a different system that maintains inequality and racial hierarchy in this country. But in all of our institutions, we have to seek this reckoning where we racial reckoning, where, white people and people of privilege have to give up power in this country, and they're only going to do it by demand. And of course, this is also a class issue and a capitalism issue. And I just want people to lose faith in the institution of the carceral state, that it helps them in any way, and take some responsibility for addressing the causes of harm in our communities.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good call to action to end on. Is there anything else you want to share before we get to the questions that everybody answers when they come on the podcast?
I think we did a good job of covering a lot. I really appreciate your questions.
Yeah, cool. Well, then we've talked around it a lot, but in your own words, define restorative justice.
No, it's as you ask this question, I'm looking out my windows at the beautiful green hills around where I live, and I see a crow perched on the top of a tree outside my window, and being asked about restorative justice really grounds me in where we started in this conversation around the web that of interrelatedness and interconnectedness that we're in, um, and the responsibility to embodying the values of justice, of equality, of forgiveness and healing that most of us have not. We might not have been given these things ourselves, and yet we are the ones that need to embody these values in order for others to be given them. And we need to give them to ourselves, and we need to give them to each other. And restorative justice means not ever forgetting that you are, as an individual, your essential longing is connection to others and healthy connection, and to follow that longing in all the work you do and all the relationships that you're a part of and all the lives that you touch.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much for that. As you've been doing this work, and we can define this work as broadly as you want to, what's been an oh shit moment? Often a moment where like you made a mistake or did something that like, oh, I wish I would have done something differently. It could also be like, ah, shit, yeah, I did that and it was awesome. And then what did you learn from it?
Oh, whoa, this one, what? This is kind of caught me off. So an oh shit or an aw shit moment, huh? I mean, there's so many oh shit moments. I mean, I have to go back to the End of Isolation tour that we did last summer. It was one of the hardest things that I've ever done. And I was lucky enough to be on a tour bus. We toured the country in a converted school bus. And it was with other formerly incarcerated actors, performing under unbelievable conditions. The climate crisis was at our doorstep every day. With flash floods in St. Louis and heat storms, unbelievable conditions. And there were just a lot of oh shit moments. But one was definitely one of the first days when some of the equipment fell off the bus into the freeway. And like the kind of, I can fix this, like, hubris of a white woman, I like stopped traffic and ran into the freeway and got the equipment back. And I thought I was being such a badass, and I'm still unpacking that and listening to interviews of other people in the crew, and just realizing that like that action made people feel so unsafe, and because I was risking my own life potentially. I mean, I felt like I was being careful, but we all have different standards of what's safe and risk standards. And just thinking it was such a challenge that summer to think outside of my own experience as a white woman, and my own personality, and my own history of like DIY adventurism, and think for the collective. And there were just so many oh shit moments where I was like, this is how it looks from my perspective, and there are 8 other people here that are seeing it from a completely different point of view. And that was definitely an oh shit and a little bit of an ah shit at the same time moment.
Absolutely. Thank you for that.
The other guy on the bus was a Latinx man, and he was running after me down the freeway, and he was like, wait a minute, I need to go in front of her, because right now what this looks like is a Latino man chasing a white woman down the freeway, and these optics are not good for me.
Yeah.
Right. So there's just so many. Yeah, it was definitely an oh shit moment for my own blindness around race, and there's just a million instances like that in the world where we have to get outside of seeing things only from our own perspectives.
Yeah. This next question is hard in a different way. You get to sit in circle with 4 people, living or dead. Who are they? And what is the one question you ask the circle?
I mean, I have to go with my ancestors because I come from an Irish Catholic background, and a lot of my ancestors, I never met. They died of
Mhm.
diseases often related to alcoholism, um, and I just have so many questions for them as far as, and so few stories. And I would really ask them, why did you come to this country? And what were you expecting to happen here? It's
Yeah.
it's something I would really, really like to know. Because here I am, thrown into this wild mix of an experiment, and trying to navigate doing it in a way that's accountable. And yet my ancestors didn't provide me with much as far as a roadmap. Really reinventing or inventing and reinventing ourselves every generation. It feels like in this country in
Yeah.
some ways.
Yeah, that question gets taken a lot of different ways. Often, like ancestors being brought in, and often from white folks, people who have those same kind of questions. The other thing that happens on this podcast is those, like, I often flip the question to the guest who asked it. What do you imagine some of their responses might have been?
I mean, I know that the time that my Irish ancestors came over here was the aftermath of um,
Hmm.
the potato. It's always called famine, but there's
Famine.
another word for it. I mean, basically, every single potato turned
Oh,
to a hard purple rock overnight. So, the disease that happened killed the food source
oh,
at
okay.
its root. And that's something
Hmm.
that I can't even imagine. They were so much in survival mode, and that actually
Yeah.
makes me understand why they adopted their whiteness and white supremacy as a way of surviving. It
Hmm.
was not a smart choice, because allying with black and brown people would have been a much more empowering choice for them and everyone else involved, because there's collective power that was lost there, and still continues to play out in our history. It, but now that you asked me the question, I'd really like to know, what was life like for you before you went into survival mode? Because I feel like
Hmm.
that famine in Ireland um, set into motion generations of survival mode, and that's something that in my lifetime I want to get out of. I want to experience life. My spirit
Yeah.
longs for experiencing life outside of a mode where you're thinking of how you're going to survive, and instead thinking of how we can thrive as communities, how we are thriving as communities. But these ancestral patterns are deeply embedded in our nervous systems, and I want to know what life was like for my ancestors before that is the mode um, of being that has started to dominate their lives.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, like, what survive, like, they might not have made the calculation that, like, I'm gonna move to America and assimilate into, like, the white cis heteropatriarchy, right? That might have been the decision that was made, and, like, collectively made by the people who they were migrating with, right? Like, not everybody. I mean, this isn't a lesson on white supremacy here, right? But, like, not everybody who first landed here with European ancestry was considered white. People have assimilated over time. Irish people were not considered white when they first landed here, but, like, what were the moments of, oh yeah, I'll assimilate and give up this part of my culture to benefit at the expense of Black and Indigenous people here. Um, Unanswerable question, but, like, survival is at the root of
Yeah, my
that. So,
spirit tells me
um,
there's something arising
always,
in my spirit that tells me that there was song, there was music in my ancestors' history that before it was about,
Mhm.
and that's true for all of us, right? But it's such a deep thing that's just arising from my spirit that there was connection to the land and there was song, and that's something that
Yeah.
is so important to maintain, to continue to cultivate.
Yeah, definitely. Last two questions. Who's one person that I should have on the podcast, and has to be someone who you can help me get on?
Oh, so many. What's the other questions? Well, I'm thinking. You said two.
Oh, the last question is, how can people support you and your work in the ways you want to be supported? So like, that's like the plug all your shit question. So this is like, in some ways, like the last answer. Last question. Yeah.
Have you had, because I'm in contact with some pretty amazing RJ people around the country. There's a woman in St. Louis that does RJ. Her name's Tracy Powell. There's
I would love
Orlando
to be in contact with Tracy.
Mayorga.
Mayorga, yeah, I've had Chili on.
That's great.
Yeah.
Oh my God, I want to listen to that episode. Yeah. The other people around that are coming to me, there's, I've heard that there are RJ people around the country. Have you had Daniel Surratt on?
No, I like Common Justice. People are like pretty protective of her time. I have direct communication with their team, but like I haven't like had direct communication with her. I would love to.
Well, I've interviewed her before. Yeah, I've met her. So if it's helpful for me to do an introduction, just let me know.
Yeah.
And there is also Restorative Justice in Oakland, the center. Tash Wynn.
Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth? Or
Restore Oakland is the Restorative Justice Center in Oakland.
Oh, okay.
Have you heard of it? It's been around for a couple of years.
I don't.
Yeah, well, Tash Wynn is the director there, and they are doing really, really incredible work. I believe it's the first center only devoted to restorative justice in the country, and it's a beautiful center in Oakland.
Are they operating in concert with the legal system?
I'm sorry. Yeah, it's transformative justice.
Oh, okay.
It's called Restore Oakland, but it's transformative justice. Yeah.
Okay.
They have all kinds of, check out their website if you're interested in interviewing Tash. Tash, Tash, last name Wynn, Nguyen.
NG, yeah, okay.
Yeah, I think they're the organization that's going to be doing grief circles for Jen Angel, and they work with RJoy in Oakland, and they just do incredible stuff about like supporting small businesses and reinvesting in communities. A lot of addressing the root causes of crime in Oakland, and also providing spaces for dialogue. So check them out.
Absolutely. And then finally, where can people support you and your work in the ways that you want to be supported?
Well, I want to be supported. One of the really invaluable ways that I have been lucky enough to get support is through feedback. Anything that I've said on this podcast that listeners want to respond to, whether it's with questions or curiosities, applause, or pros or grows. I'm really open to that. And it's easy to reach me on my website, which is just my name, sarahshourd.com. And that's Shourd, like gourd, SHOURD. Okay.
It'll be in the show notes.
And you can also stay in touch with End of Isolation at endofisolation.org. We are creating a documentary series highlighting the work of our community partners on the front lines of ending solitary confinement in alignment with abolitionist principles of decarceration around the country. So we're working on this really rad docu-series that is going to highlight the different communities around the country and what the movement looks like there. and its origins and how it's being led by formerly incarcerated organizers.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, all of those things down in the show notes or description, depending on where you're watching this. Like, subscribe, review, help us further amplify this work. Sarah, we're so grateful for your time, your wisdom, your stories. I know we could have gone on for much, much longer, and maybe we'll have you back. But we'll be back in this feed on Tuesday or Wednesday, again, depending on our production, taking the restorative justice reflections that we found from The Last of Us episode 8, and next Thursday with another episode with a conversation with someone living this restorative justice life. Until then, take care.
Thank you, David. This has been incredible.